that we were talking among ourselves, like-minded people. I think it's an important discussion. Scott Bolden, who is a regular commentator here on the show, you were listening to this conversation. I'm interested in your input and your observation from what you were hearing.
Well, it's very difficult to listen to because I think I live in the real world, and many of your guests, I guess they live in the same world, but they just see things differently. To blame Barack Obama for the race issues in this country is really disingenuous. It's got to be. Someone who the Trump supporters and Donald Trump and others accused of not living here or not being born in America, Mitch McConnell and others who announced day one their job in the Senate and the House was to make sure that he was never reelected. That's not exactly an enduring or loving relationship, and they define that, if you will. We cannot be in denial about the race issues in this country. It's not race identity politics. Both parties may play them, but it's real, practical. We have a police brutality issue. Black people are doing far less than Hispanics and Anglo-Americans in this country, and to deny it or to say that it is a race-neutral reasons for that being the case is to deny the reality of what's happening every day with black people and brown people in this country. And that race dialogue, that race reconciliation dialogue, which is what's really missing between this country, whether it was Jim Crow or slavery, we have never had that race reconciliation dialogue where both sides feel safe. So I can learn what your world is like, which doesn't include racism in many respects, and you can learn what my world is like because I see life through a race prism, not because I want to, but because my day-to-day life, I'm reminded of it every day in this America, and I am not in the majority. And so when the police, I call the police come, it may be to protect and serve, but it may be to arrest me or to brutalize me or to hurt me. When white America calls the police, most of the time, their only experience is to protect and serve. How can we both look through this prism of life the same way when our experiences are that different?
Devin?
I have to disagree a little bit about the identity politics thing, which is something that Shelby and Star and I were talking about earlier, in that as a millennial, I do see the negative impact of kind of the identifying, if I support Trump's tax reform, then I'm all these other things that make me a racist or a neo-Nazi or this really bad person in society.
No interruption. No.
Sure, but by and large, I think when you verbalize one affiliation to an idea, then you're the 10 other things that go along with that concept, kind of to what you were saying in the last segment. And I think that's the problem. You can have lots of different views that align with multiple parties, and that makes us American. I think that's something that needs to be celebrated, that I can be very socially liberal and fiscally conservative. That doesn't mean I'm entirely liberal or entirely conservative. And that doesn't make me racist.
So I want you to listen at what he said, the prism of the life that he lives through, what he has to identify with, his real world. I mean, it's for him. It cannot be ignored. How do you respond to the world he just brought into the discussion?
I respond by saying that we will get to answers if we admit where the real problems lie. And as long as there are certain issues that can't be brought to the table during discussions of, let's say, police brutality, then we're not going to be honest on either side. We won't get to the solution. Because while indeed there are problems, and we all see that, and they show up on our evening news, we must talk about unionized police forces. This was an issue 100 years ago where there was much discussion about not unionizing civil servants, because the nature of unions is the same. It's built in collectivism too, and it's built on seniority, whether it's the teachers union or the airline union or the police union. So what happens in these poor communities? They get the rookies and the rebels. Now, that's on one side, the police side. So you're either new or you're a rebel in another community, but because the union protects you, you're getting sent to a community that can't defend itself. Because what does that community look like? That community, over 50 years of a social welfare state, has collapsed in terms of marriage. Blacks moved from 70% marriage numbers into 50 to 30% today. So we have young men growing up without their dad in the home to give them a moral framework. You put these two forces together, and that's why we keep seeing fire after fire. So until the left and those that defend their positions of liberalism admit that there are other things that have gone wrong in the communities that we're so concerned about, at least that they say they're about, then we're just not going to solve this problem. So you are going to have people that don't want to show up at the table.
Now I listened, okay? and I just listened to your guests blame the police unionization and people of color for not having two family or two-person household or mother and father in a household. And so now people of color share the blame for being brutalized by the police. You cannot equivocate this. When the police show up on video, on iPad and cameras, and on iPhone cameras, right? There is but one victim, and there is but one aggressor. And the aggressor is the police. And the victim, we share no blame when you shoot me in the back while I'm running in South Carolina. We share no blame
what happens
when we come
South
to show
Carolina?
up and we get shot when we're trying to be protected by the police. We share no blame when they show up in Charlottesville with bats and weapons and shields and say they want to have a peaceful process because they're proud to be white. There is no equivocation. White supremacy is dead wrong. For years.
South Carolina, I want to talk about that.
There is no argument against that.
There is an argument.
There is really? Tell me what that argument is.
If you'll give me a moment, I will.
I will. Tell me what that argument is.
Charlottesville was a provocation, I believe.
By whom?
With a small number of white supremacists for whom I have no brief.
Pretty large. They had guns,
They had 1,000 people who were there to rumble them.
And they had more
they had shields
who
and they had
opposed them.
clubs. They had more who opposed them. That's right,
Exactly.
because it was a provocation, I believe, by an Occupy Wall Street guy who had been working for 2 years to put this thing together. So it's not always the way it seems. But the main point here is we're talking about a phenomenon that I believe is corrosive to our republic. And that is that we cannot actually talk to one another as individuals, as human beings. We have to put them into a category. And I get the pain that you feel, and I regret it profoundly. But it shouldn't color everything going forward. And I will tell you, as somebody who hoped Barack Obama would actually move us past this kind of racial divide, or all of these divides for that matter. I think there were a lot of white folks who voted for him precisely for that reason.
Exactly.
I wasn't among them, to be honest, but there was a lot of hope that he would. And the truth of the matter, that wasn't, I think, his agenda, and it certainly isn't what we've got as an inheritance of his time in office.
Well, Armstrong, let me ask this. I keep hearing about how Barack Obama is the reason why we are so racially divisive, right? Barack Obama within the African American, well, you suggested that, and more than one of you suggested that. But tell me what Barack Obama did to promote this great racial divide, because I got to tell you, within the African American community and communities of color, we got our own issues with Barack Obama, and one of the issues was that he didn't either do enough or lead enough or even use our name or that race identity politics to improve the quality of life and the socioeconomics for people of color. That's not race identity politics. That's because we want our lives to improve. And by the way, he happened to be an African American president, yes. We certainly thought that we would get more attention from him than the other 43 other presidents. That didn't happen. So I'm trying to figure out, that didn't our expectations.
Let me have one at a time, Star.
Because more than black, he was a liberal. He was a liberal with liberal.
What's wrong with that?
Let me explain. It brings secularism and big government. So what has happened over time, blacks in this country moved from slavery to Jim Crow, from Jim Crow to dependence on government. This is not healthy for any community, regardless of your ethnicity. So what has happened now, Barack Obama polarized these divides simply because when you have half the country that wants big government and half the country saying mind your own business, you are going to have tension. Those datas are not me saying it as a conservative. This is what the American people are saying, and until we recognize that this is what has happened to ourselves, and in that 9-year period of time, we're not going to be able to have. But I want to make one more point about South Carolina, because actually the policeman who shot the brother in the back in South Carolina actually makes my position correct. They did not have a unionized police force. So immediately he was arrested. He lost his job immediately. He plea bargained because he was going to jail. You made my point. Where we see union, Baltimore, Ferguson, and other places, it's not fixing itself. So as long as we deny some of the realities and we keep speaking in these generalizations, you take the uniqueness out of people. God created us unique. Everybody with something individual to bring into this world. When you segment people into little boxes and that segmentation is based on certain expectations, we're not going to solve any of these problems.
Well, I was very specific, but let me just this way, right?
We're coming back. Devin?
So I kind of want to go back to the police brutality, and if you look at the numbers, crimes against police officers by the black community have increased in the last couple of years, probably because of all the brutality that the black community is facing. But now you're saying when the police come, it's if the police come, because nobody wants to be a police officer because they feel targeted.
You know,
they
the number
feel
one
targeted.
group that kills police officers
is white people.
Are white people, not black people.
Because 99% of all crime is against someone you know.
One of the things we must do here is set an example of civility. Every argument has value, and every debate brings a perspective that someone is learning something from as they watch us live today. We're going to take a break and come back. We're going to keep the same panel. We're not switching our panels. We're coming back to the very same panel because it's necessary. We'll be back. And welcome back to our broadcast with our guests, Scott Bolden, Frank Gaffney, Devin Smith, and Star Parker. What is white supremacy to you, Scott?
White supremacy is violence. It's a racial divide. It is one who believes that they are entitled to this country to the detriment of others simply because I am black or I am brown and they are white. Within that definition is white privilege, which is innate or implicit and manifests itself every day. And those who believe in white supremacy usually comes with hate speech, which has never been free speech for people of color.
Do you agree with Stella and Frank when they say it's rare and it's overblown in this country, as they said earlier? You don't?
No, let me tell you why. Because I refuse to ignore, and our communities of color cannot ignore, big or small, high number or low number, any hate group in this country represents a threat to my community and other communities, and we cannot ignore them. We have to shine the light on them, because what the future holds is danger and the lack of safety for me and my family. And so that's why it's important to shine the light.
What about this argument?
Shining the light on a small group is fine, as far as I'm concerned.
Or a big one.
Just trying to keep in perspective that they're a small group. But I just have to say, what Scott's bought into is something that is extraordinarily corrosive to freedom. And that is that if you don't agree with that small group, or large group for that matter, you can silence them by labeling them as haters and their speech by definition as hate speech. And if you go down that road, Armstrong, there's no question, but sooner or later you wind up in the kind of collectivist state that we've been talking about throughout the program. That's not where this country should go, and I pray we won't.
Is this unfair, what I'm about to interject? Is there a difference between the black nationalism? There's a mindset among many blacks, sometimes even elite, that espouses some of the same things about whites. The racisms that blacks hear about themselves from whites, you hear it from blacks about them also. Is there a difference? Now, Scott would probably say they have no power. I don't agree with that. I think it's all corrosive. I think it's all dangerous. I think it all should be condemned.
When you take the uniqueness from someone else because they don't do what you think they should do, then yes, it's all corrupting. The challenge that I have most with this narrative of the left today about the white supremacists, the alt-right, is they deny that there's an alt-left. And there is an alt-left. And when you think about their emphasis on, for instance, the Confederate flag and why it must come down, these are the same people putting up the rainbow flag, telling Christians that they're not welcome. So you can't have it both ways. You're going to have to live free in this country. But in order to live free, we've got to understand that uniqueness comes from God. And what founded this country is freedom and personal responsibility. The biggest problem that we have, whether they're racist and or they're the hard black nationalists that are in this country, is it's easy for man's natural inclinations to blame somebody else when they have big problems. We have big problems in this country. Moral problems, fiscal problems, economic problems. So it's easier just to say it's somebody else's fault. And that's what we're seeing more and more, and especially in areas where we have public square. Public square is a law, where our lives are forced to touch. When you're an individual in your own sin, that's between you and God. But when you come into public square, this is law. And what has happened over the last 50 years is we built laws, rules, rooted in liberalism that shut down anyone that doesn't agree while they're taking your money. This is why we're seeing the tension. We're having a tax debate right now, and they've already labeled it as you're just trying to help wealthy people. Really? No, some of us are actually trying to get significant tax reductions in these urban centers so that their economics will grow. But the minute you bring up perspective, you're labeled, and therefore you can't even get things that are
She makes a very good point. In this country, the media has reduced everything to left and right,
That's right.
Republican and Democrat,
That's right.
and there are no expansive solutions.
No.
Once you hear that, you go into your camp.
That's right.
It is true.
Yeah.
It's horrible.
It
It's
is
not
true.
just media, though.
No, and to answer
It
the
is
first
the schools.
question
Yeah.
about what does white supremacy mean to me, I think it's a dying breed. I think you're right. It's a small number. Their numbers have not really changed in the last couple of years. Whereas in crimes in 2016, there was more black identity extremists who committed more crimes than the white supremacists. And I think when I saw the topic of the show, the first thing I thought was white supremacy is a problem, no doubt, but why aren't we talking about BLM, the Antifas, and what outnumbered all of those crimes is the radical Islamic threat. And I think that's another issue that we should kind of draw into this conversation, because they've grown 180% in the last 2 years. There was the number of people that have been arrested associating with radical
But this
Islam.
is the key point, I think, Armstrong, is if you can put any of those things off of limits, if Black Lives Matter or Antifa or the Islamists are beyond the pale, if you even bring them up, you're called a hater, you're called a bigot, you're called a racist, a white supremacist, or whatever else. It is aimed at suppressing freedom, not assuring it. It doesn't speak to the diversity of our country. It insists on conformity to somebody's standard. And I believe that fundamentally that has been the hard left at work, but they've also been greatly enabled and are in the service of the Sharia supremacists.
Your statement begs further analysis. So if the KKK, if the John Birch Society, if white supremacists and the alt-right and whatever we label them, who majority are violent groups against black people and brown people, and I want to call them out because I fear them, and I fear that my safety is at issue, and I want to call them out, and I want laws passed to protect me vis-a-vis hate crimes and what have you. Am I wrong to do that, or am I trying to suppress them? Well, of course, I'm trying to eliminate them. Just like I think it should be illegal to have them, it should be illegal to be in an urban gang, too, by the way. The hard left, however, I don't want to be labeled the hard left. I'm just reacting to what I'm seeing. And you cannot ignore or intellectualize these issues.
Scott, if you have statements about jihadists in our midst.
Absolutely.
Today, you're not allowed to say that.
I wasn't
that
asked.
Is hate speech.
What?
If you mention,
a jihadist?
If you mention Sharia supremacism as a problem in America today, that gets you labeled as a white supremacist.
I've never heard anybody argue that, quite frankly.
That's how I was introduced.
I argue as the terrorist that if you're a terrorist and you're doing damage in this country, you ought to be tried, and we ought to keep you out of this country, especially the violent immigrants, okay? Yeah. Now, I can say that because I'm an American. I love this country, if not more, as much as everybody on this panel.
Let me interject on the question.
I can see my people suffering, and I don't care what you say.
People?
Black people are suffering. Brown people are suffering. We are all suffering.
Let me
You've been subject to racism, and so have I.
But here's the
you cannot deny that and intellectualize it.
Let her respond.
I didn't say it doesn't matter. It's who handles it. And the challenge that we've seen over the last 50 years is the black community thinks it's all federal, that everything about our lives and where they touch should come out of Washington, D.C. Go back to Charlottesville. I actually agree with you. The alt-right should not have been there. When you talk about a local community with a local issue, that is their local business. We battle in the voting booth in this country. They battled. They elected a city council. The city council then decided to remove a statue that was on an auction block. That's what government does, puts up and takes down. That, frankly, wasn't the federal government's business, and it wasn't my business as a California.
This narrative of yours.
Therefore, then all of a sudden, they drag the president into this discussion
10 seconds.
of a local
10
issue.
seconds.
Let me see if he can
this
do quick.
narrative that liberals and people of color want the federal government to have entitlements and what have you. Let me tell you something. The top 10 states who receive the most entitlements, right, in this country, country, in the southern United States, they're all red states, they all have Republican governors, and it is a misnomer that people of color want federal government and entitlements to save their lives or to save their communities. It's just not, because white Southerners get more entitlements than any other group in this country. Those are facts.
Scott for joining us, because when we come back, Shelby and Stella will return in our final segment. Star's not going anywhere. We'll be back.